Well, thank you very much. So with this, we move on to our next panel discussion, which is channeling research into public policy. My apologies that we are 10, 15 minutes behind schedule. And with your, with your due permission, we may extend it by maybe 10 minutes as we move along. So,
Yes, please.
um, Rohan, can you take over and do the welcome, please?
Absolutely, Dr. Dhanjal. Can I request the host to please pin us to the screen? Host Scotch, are we on?
Yes, we are good to go.
Right. At the very outset, I would like to thank the hundreds of live audience which has stayed with us with faith, patience, and rapt attention throughout the proceedings of the day. The second Public Policy Forum and the 70th SKOCH Summit, organized in collaboration with RIS, CUTS International, ICRIA, Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, as well as our academic partners, the Bharati Institute of Public Policy at the Indian School of Business, OP Jindal Global University, as well as the National Law School of India, University, Bangalore. This panel discussion comes to us in the spirit of bringing public policy to bear to address governance challenges as we have done throughout the day. The panel discussion on channeling research into public policy comes at a very relevant time when public discourse, and by extension, political opinions and attitudes towards policies are becoming increasingly polarized. This panel explores the role that policy can play in the lives of individuals and how academia, research institutions, and universities can help and contribute towards bolstering positive opinions and attitudes regarding policies. With no further ado, I would like to welcome our keynote speaker for the day, Dr. Mike Seiferling, who joins us from University College London. Dr. Seiferling is MPA Program Director and Assistant Professor of Public Finance at the School of Public Policy, UCL. His research focuses on the links between macroeconomics, finance, accounting, and political science, specifically taxation, budgeting, fiscal performance, public sector accounting, and accountability. Dr. Seiferling has spent many years working with the IMF, the World Bank, and the United Nations in the past. Previously, Dr. Seiferling worked as an economist with the IMF, and he completed his PhD from the London School of Economics in 2012. Our moderator for the day, Professor R. Sudarshan, Dean of the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy at the OP Jindal Global University, has had distinguished careers in the domains of research, development, programming, and governance. After he obtained his master's degree in economics from the Delhi School of Economics, he went on a Rhodes Scholarship to study at Balliol College, University of Oxford, for his master's degree in politics. He was elected to a research fellowship at St. John's College, University of Cambridge, where he studied judicial review of economic legislation by the Supreme Court of India. We welcome you, Professor Sudarshan. Dr. Arushi Jain, Associate Director of the Bharati Institute of Public Policy, Indian School of Business, has wide experience and expertise in the public policy domain as a faculty administrator as well as project specialist. She is currently working as the Associate Director of the Bharati Institute of Public Policy, ISB. Professor Soni Pelisseri of the National Law School of India, University, Bengaluru, is an associate professor for the Center of Study of Social Exclusion and Inclusive Policy, and he is a public policy specialist with special interest in distributive justice. He teaches the courses on Introduction to Public Policy and Analysis. After his doctoral studies from Oxford University, he held the position of associate professor at the Indian Institute of Rural Management, IRMA, Anand. In 2009, Professor Pelisseri won the India Social Science Research Award for his academic contributions. Dr. Indraneel Mukhopadhyay is Associate Professor at Jindal Global University. He teaches public health, health economics, comparative health systems, and development economics at the School of Government and Public Policy. Professor Mukhopadhyay holds a PhD in public health and economics from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. With that, I would like to invite Dr. Gursharan Dhanjal, Managing Director and Editor, SKOCH Group, for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Rohan. I welcome all the policy professionals from the academic side to throw light on this very important topic, which is what has been under discussion since morning. There's so much of public policy that we have discussed. What is the takeaway is something which is what we would like to deliberate during this discussion. So there are two ways to policy making. One is experience, second is evidence. And either way, it is backed by policy research that ends up throwing problems and the possible solutions based on the ground research, which we call outcome-based policy making. So public policy research always has a very, very specific purpose and objective to influence the formal and informal policies formulated by policymakers. Thus, it is important to collect good information and present it in a compelling manner. So that is the role that research plays. The ideal is that your research will clearly show that the needs or problems you want to address are real and serious, and that the methods you recommend for addressing them have in fact been proven successful. You do conduct research that can often be used to gain the backing of public and slash, I would say, or policymakers for dealing with a particular issue. They may be surprised to learn how many people it affects or how common it is in their communities, or they may totally reject it. In many cases, policymakers can use your research to champion something they already favor but have no support for. So they look for that support in the research that comes from an institution like yours. Alternatively, you might be able to use your research to pressure policymakers to address an issue they would prefer to ignore. That's the flip side. So based on what we are going to be discussing, to support or discredit a specific method or practice, or to identify and advocate for appropriate policy in a given situation, is the very objective of policy research. So who should conduct research? Traditionally speaking, there are academics, research institutes, and think tanks which are not consulted. There are government agencies, either the ones promoted by the government or NGOs funded by the government, reaching at predetermined conclusions. Next in line are professional associations, which in pursuit to flatter, end up doing substandard research. Next, there are appointed commissions by the government, which are more recommendatory in nature. Whether or not their recommendations get implemented is a secondary question. Alternatively, there are watchdogs, whom you may call whistleblowers, followed by those organizations that actually work directly with people at the grassroots and are not influenced by anyone. That means to say they believe in speaking the truth. Most of such work, which qualifies as outcome-based analysis or impact assessment, is actually much in demand when it comes to the advanced countries. Unfortunately, this is not the case in India. It is rejected. Most of such work that remains pro bono also remains uninfluential. So if you are able to gain policy change, continued research will allow you to show policymakers they made the right decision. Research helps you to continue your policy inputs as conditions or the needs of the community change. Therefore, public policy research alternatively is also called advocacy research, that differs from scientific and other academic research in that it seeks to influence making of policy. It is a powerful tool for helping you to influence the information and modification of policy on your issue in your area of specialization. If you do understand how to use it, it can lead to better services, service delivery, and bring in a real social change. So with this, I hand over to Professor Sudarshan to moderate the panel. You have to unmute yourself.
That's the usual thing. I hope I'm audible now. I'm very grateful to you for inviting the General School of Government and Public Policy to be a knowledge partner in this event, along with other institutions whom we mentioned, including the Bharati Institute. and I see Dr. Arushi Jain is with us. I have to say that you've set out the challenges for policy research very well indeed, including identifying in detail the institutions that take up that research and the reasons why they don't have much impact or take us in the policy realm. I think one of the things that you have done through this foundation, the SKOCH Foundation, is you are a kind of a research entrepreneur. You're bringing to the platform different people, scholars who do research, um, people who make policy, people who implement policy. And I've been listening through the sessions all day long, and I find that you've got in these awards such a rich array of experience that we need to incorporate into our curriculum and teaching. We need to get our faculty and students to be able to write up case studies of many of these institutions that you have recognized for what they've actually achieved in terms of good public policy outcomes. So I want to record my gratitude to you, and I hope that this will be the beginning of a continual collaboration, not just an annual once in a day summit, but through the times to come, that we'll work closely with my faculty and the research students and all of the institutions with whom you associate. Because one of the things that policy academics don't have is a network of contacts. You have an amazing network of people that you, from high-level decision makers, from the Prime Minister downwards. We just saw that video clip of people who make things happen in the country, and to get an inroad into some of these people so that they take cognizance of good research that would come from different institutions. That role is very, very significant. And we need to coin a term that defines that role. I don't know whether it's a policy research entrepreneur or what, but it's that intermediary role is seriously lacking in our country. And the SKOCH Foundation is a rare institution in that respect. I also wish to say that academics generally, tend to be somewhat, it's not for nothing that universities are described as ivory towers, to kind of signify that they are kind of disconnected from the real world. Actually, they do a lot of interesting and important work based on field work, but there is the incentive structure in universities is not appropriate. In other words, they will ask us to publish in Scopus listed journals because the rating agencies of universities look at those publications, and that creates a kind of an insular attitude. I think you used the phrase in describing the forum as an academic echo chamber in academic publishing, where few people are talking to themselves. These academic articles in these journals are read by other academics and a handful of people, and there is no reward structure for research that has practical consequences and a social impact. So this is a challenge for universities, particularly for public policy education schools, to change the reward structure to say, do work that has an impact, that makes a difference to people, that can be measured, that can be described, whatever. So that's an important point I wanted to emphasize, and we'll need your help in developing some metrics for this, because anyone can claim that their work has had some impact, but we need to have some objective, systematic way by which we assess the value of public policy oriented research. And so here is a research agenda that Dr. Danjal and I have to explore. But with those words, I'll invite our keynote speaker.
Professor Sudarshan, you have really done a fantastic context setting. I think it would be rather appropriate that we bring in Dr. Mike
Yes.
at this moment and hear him speak first before we,
Very
that
good.
would be an alternate, opinion, which will come from across, and then we get on to the discussion. So may I hand over the mic to you, Dr. Mike.
Good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak today. Thanks to the organizers, to the sponsors. I'm really flattered to be invited to speak as a keynote speaker. And I'm happy to hear the words of my colleagues that preceded me, because I'm going to follow on a similar trajectory. So if possible, I'm going to share a screen with you. Can everybody see this?
Yes, we
Yes?
can, Dr. Saifullah.
Okay.
If you
So I
would
only
like to
have 10
go
minutes.
to full screen, if you would like to go to full screen on your PPT.
Good suggestion. Thank you. Okay, so I only have 10 minutes. I'm going to breeze through this fairly quickly, but I'm looking forward to having a conversation about the insight that I'm trying to offer in these first few slides. So when I was initially asked to speak today, there was 4 questions that were mentioned by my colleagues briefly, relating to the role of academia and what is their relationship with government or with government officials, and then can we move forward as academics in terms of getting out of the ivory tower and being a little bit more hands-on with real-world experience. I can say that before I even start speaking, I was in academia, and then I left academia to go to the IMF, and then I came back to academia, and you see this very big difference between real world problems and academic problems. Some things that are just difficult to recognize, like the sheer volume of the public sector. For example, in India, between public corporations and government, it's a huge, huge volume of different interests that require a lot of different specialized attentions that academics themselves don't really have to worry about or deal with. So this is a little bit of the theme that I'm going to cover in this quick 10-minute rant. I'll cover the first 3 questions briefly, and I think implicitly it will answer the 4th question, and then we can have a discussion about the findings, let's say. So, is the onus of creating an informed civil society on academia? I would say no to this question, but there is some caveats, let's say, to that answer. First of all, there's a two-way street, and my colleagues mentioned in the opening address that we need to have more interaction between government and academics, because there is a mutually beneficial relationship to be had there, in terms of policymakers are meant to, they have a bigger mandate, they have a bigger audience. Academics have the time and the resources, and they're not biased in the sense that they're being financed by special interests to help create social welfare maximizing policies, which is what we really want in the end. So the idea that academics should be responsible, I don't think is the right way to put it, but there needs to be a better two-way street between government and academia. There needs to be better partnerships between academia and government, and academics themselves need to see that their input, their effort is actually being listened to and used by government, rather than, you know, if academics are spending quite a bit of time writing papers, doing research, and then it's really interest groups or other parts of of society that are influencing policy outcomes, then academics can feel like it's not worth it to try to create impact because they're not being listened to enough. This also integrates into the idea that academia is not just an ivory tower. Academia is like government, filled with silos, filled with people that I'm an economist, I'm a political scientist, I'm a psychologist, and that's what I do, rather than thinking about what is the problem and how do we solve it, which usually requires multidisciplinary input. So from my experience working in India, the legal framework is a bit old and clunky, which prevents a lot of things from moving forward. Just general foundations within government, how government works, methodological guidelines, leadership. It's probably underutilized, or the message that's coming from that data is not being clearly communicated, let's say, to the general public. So the answer that I'm trying to give on this slide, or to the first question, is that this needs to be a two-way street where government and academia are working together until the policy outcome or the policy output can be seen, and then we have impact and we have advertisement and we can communicate those things, which I'm going to get into. Okay, moving to the second question, making specialized academic research more mainstream. One idea here that came out in the first with the first speaker was the communication with a heterogeneous population. So if we have in India many different types of people with different levels of education and different levels of knowledge and different levels of beliefs, and their upbringing and all the things that contribute to what they think is true or how they process truth. Academics are also not PR experts, which unfortunately some of them think they are, and they're not. We're generally not great at communicating what we do sometimes, or it can be so complex that we can't communicate it in a simple way. In this sense, I would advocate that we need to build better bridges. So we don't need to move academics away from some of the complicated things that they're doing, as long as we create those bridges so we have people in between that can communicate what is the main message, what are you doing to make society a better place, or to improve the welfare of the general population in your research, and then to be able to communicate that in very, very simple ways. This is something that surprised me in academia, is that often we strive to create big words to sound smart when there's a perfectly good small word already in place that everybody understands, but we don't want to use that because maybe it doesn't get published or we don't sound smart or whatever it may be. So we need to think about how we communicate, how government communicates, and who is the audience for communication. We need to tailor those messages. And I'm going to draw on some example from the central bank or research into central banks, which generally have focused a lot more on how do we communicate, who do we communicate to with regards to monetary policy. So there's a quote from Shui in 1999. It's not enough to know. It's not enough that everyone knows about a revaluation. I have to know that you know it. You have to know that I know it. I have to know that you know it, and so on. So this is kind of the motivation that I want to drive home when it comes to fake news and myths in the media and all of the things that we're confronted with in the digital age. So what we need to create is common knowledge throughout societies. We need to have common knowledge in India about fundamental things, rather than having pockets of different ideas or myths or misconceptions about government failures, government strengths, government programs, so on and so forth. So the conclusion I would draw, before I mention that we're in a society, or India has a plethora of data, tons and tons of very interesting data. We have lots of information and we have very little knowledge, right? We're not using that information in ways that make society better off, and it could be partly because of the volume, which is the first point that I'm making in this slide. There's tons and tons of research papers that relate to government policy or government outcomes, or how to do things better, how to make things more efficient. Within academia, within government, the policy papers are endless. You could live 200 years and you wouldn't be able to understand the activities of one ministry within government, or the tax code of India. Probably nobody in India understands that full tax code, only parts of it. So we need to simplify. We need to find knowledge, we need to say we're not just collecting all this data, we're using this data to create some knowledge out of it. And then we need to decide what is the true message. So one of my colleagues that preceded me said that we need to have more interaction between academia and government to create outcomes or to create impact. First, we need to decide who or how we siphon through all of this information, because yes, I think the government should listen to me, but there's 100 other Dr. Mike Seiferlings out there who are saying the same thing and probably have different ideas. So what is the true message, and how do we filter through all of everybody's contribution, which is generally very valuable, and find one synthesized message? Here's a quick example from the WHO that I came across recently, where communication with the public on some of the myths surrounding COVID is important, right? If you're a true believer that 5G is creating COVID, then you probably need some resources that will counter the arguments that you're reading on Twitter or that you're reading on, your friend's blog or whatever. So the WHO has created this wonderful kind of platform where you can go into these myths and they're dispelled through scientific means. I think I'm almost out of time here, so I'm just going to breeze through these last few slides. Should academia break free from the echo chamber? I would argue yes and no. If you asked me 2 years ago, I would say yes, and now I'm a little bit of both. So we still need a little bit of the echo chamber in order to allow for deeper, more insightful, longer term thought. In Canada, they used to call the Senate the sober second thought, so they could reflect a little bit more. They're not accountable to the public, so on and so forth. I think this role is still important, but there is a movement in the UK, and from what I heard in the opening remarks, a little bit in India towards impact. So when we're thinking about promotions, when we're thinking about moving forward with a career in academia, the question of impact is often asked, and the methodology is often, give us a case study, show us a case study of not just the paper you wrote, but how that paper moved into the real world and created some kind of change that made the lives of people better off. The other point that I want to make is building on the communication point that I mentioned before. It always surprises me that you can, right now I could write a message on Twitter and you would have more people having read that message than it would take years to have an academic journal be read. It's very surprising to me that we have, average readership of academic journals of 4 or 5, maybe in a good journal, 4 or 5 people per year. So we need to think about more collaborative projects and ways of communicating research in a way that is still useful and is still based on research and still based on objective facts, but is also put in, given in a way that can be digested by the general public and not in fancy journals that take a lot of research and a lot of time to understand, and may not even be that big of a contribution, to be fair. So my closing thoughts. This is kind of what I'm envisioning in general in terms of how we're thinking about the social contract. And for me, this is the most important thing that we need to think about in the 21st century, is a question of what is the social contract and is it broken, and what role does everybody play in that contract? So we have citizens, corporations, interest groups all inputting into the preferences of their politicians. They're trying to influence politicians in order to get policy outcomes that are preferable or that are social welfare maximizing. Then we have the politicians and the bureaucrats interacting in order to produce those results, and then an action, and then we create value. If there's a break in any of these links in the chain, then there's a problem in society. And this is why we're now questioning whether there's a break in the social contract, or whether there's at least a fracture, is that some people in this process feel like that chain is broken, or that other parts of the chain are given more priority than them. So we need to think about what we're trying to achieve is the bottom. We want to create value. We want to be able to advertise that value and communicate that value, but it's at least the perception of society is that that's not happening. And if it is happening, we need to communicate it better. And if it's not happening, we need to find which chain is broken and explain why it's broken and fix it. And I think that would be the best means to creating impact. Sorry, I've gone 1 or 2 minutes over, but I'll conclude there and stop sharing this and open the floor to my esteemed colleagues.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Sifaling. That was very, very useful. It reminded me that there was a professor of economics in Jaipur called Professor Raj Krishna, and he once used the phrase, he said the government of India, just as a watch is waterproof, the government of India is knowledge proof. This was picked up by a political scientist called Rajini Kothari, who was very fond of this. But I think that's beginning to change. That's changed a lot. We wouldn't have a school of public policy or institutions teaching that now. It's a very recent phenomenon. And that's happened because we believe that government in the states as well as in the union government are now more receptive to analysis and research inputs from outside. Before this, I mean, it was mentioned that I studied at Balliol. It had a master called Benjamin Jowett, and a quotation attributed to him is that I am Benjamin Jowett, I'm the master of this college, and what I don't know isn't knowledge. And a lot of our bureaucrats, sort of took that rather seriously. I'm talking about the past. I'm talking about a more optimistic future where it's possible, we hope, that we will have communication, that government will realize that it's impossible to run it through generalists, that the world has become complex. Complexity is what, and unpredictability, risk, uncertainty, these are what are the realities. And therefore, it's not possible for policymakers to be smug and confident that they know the answers, and they will have to reach out to a variety of people. The other point I wanted to make is with respect to academia. I mean, you made the point, yes and no, to that answer about journals. That's right, because you see, knowledge is cumulative and it builds on itself, and we need an avenue for knowledge to advance. So you work on what previously people have done, and you contribute to that for knowledge's sake. I mean, you don't have to defend that kind of work by some instrumental purpose or social impact. It's very important to have knowledge advanced for the sake of knowledge, because you never know when that knowledge will come and have a practical consequence. But it's equally important that the accumulated knowledge that we already have is used in a sensible way, that we look to what science knows about vaccines at this point in time, and have policymakers knowledgeable, or at least get a grasp of what that is in order to advance human well-being. So I think you set out the stage very clearly. We hope that there'll be many more institutions, research think tanks in the country. We are a handful of public policy educators now in India. And I wanted to turn to our first panelist, Dr. Arushi Jain. She's going to organize a big conference in March, partially face-to-face, partially online, as part of a group of institutions that are part of what's called the India Public Policy Network. So I'd like to ask her to talk about, what are the, are you optimistic that policy research can actually make a difference and influence policy?
Thank you so much, Dr. Sudarshan, for this kind introduction. Very good evening, everyone, and thanks to Mr. Sameer Kochhar, Mr. Rohan Kochhar, and Dr. Gursharan Dhanjal for organizing this very informative day-long, policy forum, where all of us got to know a lot about what is happening, and especially picking up from the conversation that Professor Sudarshan just had, and talked about how we can develop case studies across the best practices that have been happening across the country. So I'm going to pick up from there and especially emphasize that this is something that is required when we are talking of policy research, because it is very important to understand whether these smaller interventions are scalable, replicable, and to also learn from these practices so that, the efforts are not duplicated after a few years and there is this continuity in research. So having said that, the topic that we are discussing, and I am definitely optimistic here, is channeling research into public policy. And interestingly, academics has been pitched as the fourth estate. So as the fourth estate, it is a very powerful role in influencing and shaping the political and the public spheres. So today, as there is an increased focus on evidence-informed policies, there has to be a mutual influence between the practitioners and academicians. The academics right now is not working in silos as it used to a few years ago. If we look at trends across the world, academicians are contributing effectively to policy formulation, be it the identification of problems for public interest or focusing on possible solutions through their research. So academic knowledge, evidence, and expertise can help in informing, designing, improving, and even testing the public policies. But this is only possible when we can develop a kind of an ecosystem for this engagement to nourish. So when we are talking of channeling research, it begins with the political context. There has to be credibility of evidence. There has to be a link between the institutions, the research institutions, as well as the link with the policy formulators here. And the role of the environment, I'm here referring to the external context, the socio-cultural milieu that we all live in is really important. So, long we have been talking about these complex adaptive systems that are existing and we all live in it. And policy is continuously evolving in this setup. And once research institutions start understanding the importance of this, this entire framework and how they can contribute into it, I think that would be the right time when we will be able to channelize a lot of research into policy. I was mentioning about the ecosystem. So here, partnerships between government, academia, private sector, civil society are really important, wherein research can be channelized to take informed policy decisions. This ecosystem has to be built on trust. The trust has to be true-faceted, and I think that is one of the biggest gap at this point of time. And institutions like SKOCH have a big role to play along with academics to be the intermediaries, as Dr. Sudarshan just referred to. I would, when we are talking of trust, it has to be quality of research, academic excellence, integrity in research when it comes to the side of the academics. But on the other side, when it comes to government, there has to be a partnership. The partnership can be multifaceted. However, one of the things that clearly comes to mind is the emphasis that we have been giving since morning on data. So credibility of data. There is a lot that data can do today, be it in terms of better governance, real-time data, high frequency, high resolution indicators. We are talking of predictive analytics. All that can help solve a lot of problems that the country is facing. But all we need here is credible data from the government sources. A lot of private institutions are working well in this regard, but if government can partner and can actually help the research community, it's going to work wonders. Another aspect that we have in this discussion is the mainstreaming of academic research. And, when I think about the gaps that are existing, I am reminded of a very nice paper that I read from Shapiro et al. That talks about two interesting types of gaps that exist in research. So the first is called as the research lost in translation gap. And the second is called as the research lost before translation gap. So the first one here is the research fails to reach the practitioners. And the second is that the results are unconnectable. So when we talk about the second part, it is basically the rigor relevance gap that the academicians have been talking in research for a long time. And that can be bridged by, understanding the problem statement better, collaborating with practitioners right from the beginning, and then understanding research question correctly and taking up relevant research. When it comes to the second one, the lost in translation, it is basically the gap, it's basically the gap that exists when we are unable to translate our research to the right forums. So academic research many times remains in the journals and it is not translated to the people who can use it and apply it for policy formulation and dissemination. This can be done through organization of roundtables, seminars, panels, and the reference to IPPN just came. one of the forums that we want to organize and bring in practitioners and academicians, to talk about and to think about this second aspect. So with this, I think it's a very hopeful time. The civil society is evolving. Academics is playing a very important role in evolving the civil society, and the multi-stakeholder synergy is visible at this time. However, I think there needs to be an effort of the universities in playing an important role in bringing out the socio-political, economic, and cultural transformation, and to have informed citizenry who can understand their rights and responsibilities and impact policies so that the lives and livelihoods of the citizens of the country are impacted and improved. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Jain. I have to inform the audience that the Bharati Institute has a major project on data, and the data is designed to be used by journalists, which means that there is a lot of attention has been paid to communicability, because the journalists are not expected to be experts in the domains that the data is informative about. So that's a very valuable service to the country, I would say. And we should encourage journalists and civil society activists to make use of that database, which is made available gratis. You don't have to pay huge amounts and so on. India is in a very rather special country. I don't know, there may be some others, but a lot of policy making in this country increasingly is happening in the courts. Soni Pellissieri is running a public policy school in what could be the foremost, the leading law school in the country. So he's continually surrounded by all these students eager about the law and the faculty about law. So I wanted to ask him, really about, when you're running a public policy school embedded, even in our university, the law school is rather dominant. But I'm wondering if there is a difference between how you communicate policy research to civil servants and ministers, and is there Arushi referred to lost in translation. It seems to me that in our country there's a serious loss in translation between what the policymakers intend when they draft a law and what the courts understand it to be, because they were not part of the process by which the policy was formulated. They're sitting there looking at a piece of text and the constitution alongside, and feeling rather powerful that they may interpret the constitution. The constitution is what I say it is kind of attitude. So I wanted you to reflect a little bit of that, because that's a very real issue. No policy in this country goes uncontested in the Supreme Court on constitutional grounds. And so how do we have a pedagogy for public policy that kind of enables the research to be communicative to two different sets of constituencies who have a role in policy? Soni, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Sudarshan, for asking this very challenging question. I hope I will be able to respond it through my short intervention. Let me also thank SKOCH Group for having invited me to this prestigious event. This is really a wonderful time to be part of the Public Policy Forum in India, because this is the maturing space of policy studies in India. It is last 1 decade, and come another 2 decades, this space will be entirely different. And these will be shaped by forums such as these kind of debates. And therefore, I'm very grateful we have got an early lead to be part of this policy forum. Thank you, SKOCH Group. Let me connect the Professor Sudarshan's question with what I heard from Dr. Mike at the very beginning, the challenge of building common knowledge. And to respond, actually the question Dr. Professor Sudarshan asked is exactly that question of, do we have a common knowledge created? Are public policy schools playing the role of building a common knowledge? I have two responses to this, particularly being in this panel on channeling research into public policy. First response is about the nature of the state in India, and second response is nature of the research in India. And here on the nature of the state in India, I want to refer to Land Pritchard's wonderful phrase on is Indian state failing? He is saying, no, Indian state is not a failing state. And he has an expression called it's a flailing state. And he says it's flailing state because its head has got wonderful decisions, flamboyant policy makers, English-speaking wonderful elites. But whatever they speak, the public don't understand what is going on. In other words, there is a huge disconnect between the beautiful executive head and the tail, which is completely disconnected. That's what he calls as the flailing state. And Indian state is exactly that. And it is in this context, this challenge of building common knowledge becomes the agenda for public policy schools, and what kind of a research is possible in such a scenario. Traditional discipline-oriented research, which creates evidence and leave it with the belief that the road from evidence or science to policy making is direct, is a problem. In other words, the road from evidence to policy making is a very murky road. There is no direct relationship between them. And therefore, if we believe that I create evidence and I leave it to policymaker to make a decision based on it, we are living in fool's paradise, especially in contexts such as ours, where there is a flailing state. So that is my first comment on what exactly is the problem of Indian state, where we need to reorient our public policy pedagogy. I'll come to that solution, which Dr. Pradarshan asked earlier as to, is there a public policy pedagogy that is possible in India, which may be distinct from other schools in global north? The second point to which I want to come is I want to touch on the foundational principles of science. And here I want to go back to a text which is 100 years old, that is Max Weber's Vocation to Science. And it's a classic one, especially when you do doctoral studies, you are made to read that, read Vocation to Science, and test for yourself, do you have a call to be a scientist? Do you have a call to be a researcher? Max Weber in that text, Vocation to Science, makes a very interesting proposition. What he says is, what is a researcher's call? What is a researcher made of? And he defines a key characteristics for a researcher. A scientist puts his whole life, day and night, he sits and works, puts all his time and energy to invent something, to come up with something very useful for the world, very useful for himself, very useful for the ideational world. The idea is after that. But having invented it, he is waiting in such a manner that another scientist will come and will destroy it. And if that openness is not there for the scientist, that is, let another person come and destroy it, you are not a core scientist. That's what Max Weber defines a scientist is. Basically, Max Weber is inviting us, a scientist need to have an attitude of building a progress in the world. And how will that happen? Max Weber gives solution. It is only through a debate, an openness for debate. A scientist who is ready to contest with others in whatever he produced. He doesn't believe what I produced is the end of it. Everybody should read it like a religious picture, a scripture. Let people come, let another scientist come and break it. And that exactly is the core principle of public policy. In other words, public policy is about valuation and debating about how our valuation is around any principle that we want to move on towards what we want to move on. So the whole question of public policy pedagogy as to how can we have a distinct public policy pedagogy, in some ways this affects law as well as also policy making, especially policy making when it is technocratic, when policy is seen as a technocratic solution to the world that we are dealing with. And here we need to engage in a public policy education in such a manner that we are able to connect them with the world. In other words, the flailing state situation of disconnect between head and tail, we should be able to bridge. And it is exactly in this sense, when we designed public policy program at National Law School, we said we should not replicate what Professor Sudarshan said, that is, say, you are feeling that I interpret the constitution, I decide everything. No, we need to create human beings who will be able to go to a remote part of the village, live with them for a month, and understand the logic, policy logic through their eyes and heart. So after 3 months of our students joining us, we send them to villages, tell them, you stay in a village, Indian village. If you survive with that Indian village talking to them, you will survive the policy world. But if you can deal with policy question only through computers and data science, you are only strengthening the flailing state of India. You are not bridging the gap between the head and the tail. And we need to move to that generating debate. And in my own view, each of the universities has to, public policy universities have to move towards being an engaged universities. I'm not talking we have to have a activist universities, but engaged universities where this kind of an experience of student able to incorporate these ideas or people's logic and trying to incorporate that into policy logic. So if we have the disconnect between people's logic and policy logic, then we will only be increasing the problem that we presently have. I'll stop there and over to.
Thank you very much, Professor Pellissery. That was very, very insightful. One of my colleagues, Shiv Vishwanathan, coined a phrase. He calls it cognitive justice, by which he means epistemologically, we shouldn't overvalue the knowledge that's published in academic journals, that we must value the knowledge that ordinary people have, about their lives, about things. We had the minister, Mr. Arjun Munda from Jharkhand, a tribal area, talking about, the vast resources of knowledge that tribal people have, that indigenous people have, which gets overlooked because it's not channeled into the usual universities and journals and publications. But we must encourage a new generation of students, particularly those studying public policy, to value that knowledge, to go and seek it out, to talk to them, and to have a certain humility that, because they've come to universities and they have been taught by professors with qualifications from famous universities, it doesn't mean that they are, superior and their education is better. That kind of, the attitude that, what I find and what I assert could be falsified by somebody else. An initial premise of humility is a requirement. And I think, because, in the end, education is what remains with our students. And what remains with them are certain virtues that they can inculcate, certain attitudes, certain outlook. They may forget, Rostow's 4 stages of growth or whatever we may teach. So it's important that you stress that you send your students out for an immersion with ordinary people within a village and learn from them. And that inculcates more than just, analytical rigor in students. Now, I want to turn to my dear colleague, Indranil. He's a public health specialist. And I want to ask him a question about what we are currently concerned about. We are currently concerned about vaccines. The whole world is, in a way. There's a lot of worry about have the vaccines that have been approved, have they been prematurely approved? Have they been approved because somebody wants to score a political brownie point? President Trump was very keen that, it should happen sooner than later because it might have helped his electoral prospects. That's very real and true. I mean, you can't blame politicians for that. But it's a question about, how do we ensure that how do we first judge what is good science in this context, and how do we evaluate policy decisions that's made when, you know, knowledgeable people about public health would know this is the right thing to do. I'm very glad that Mike showed us that slide from WHO about all the myths that need to be debunked, and which can be debunked because there's good scientific knowledge related to them. So Indranil, tell us about, you know, what state are we in? I mean, with respect to the policy in tackling COVID-19, what's your assessment of how well we've done or how well we have not done?
Thank you, Professor Sudarshan. Thanks, SKOCH team. I'm one of the probably last speaker of a long day, which is almost going for 12 hours or so. So I'll try to be brief, but it's really exciting time. While I'll try to respond to the vaccine question briefly, but also to the large, I would also respond to the debate that some of my esteemed colleagues have brought in here very rightly. So if we look at the developments related to vaccine, what we are seeing is a wonderful example of how political will, scientific research, and then policy come together in the development of vaccines. You know, the existing evidence on vaccines had been that it takes more than 5 years to at least 5 years to come up with a vaccine when you have developed, say, a basic understanding about the virus. And what we saw in the case of COVID is the basic ingredient of making the vaccine, the gene mapping of the virus, was made publicly available. And then we saw researchers across the world coming together, collaborating together, and producing numerous vaccines in unprecedented time span. Many people challenged. We also thought it is going to be, it would be very rushed. It can't be done in such short period. But scientists have shown enormous will, and they have worked tiringly to produce the vaccines across the world. So that's a very encouraging story of improvement in science and technology, and how that can inform the policy makers. What we also see at the same time regarding the vaccines, particularly in the context of India and any other developed countries, we see that there is vaccine has become a political issue of vaccine nationalism of some kind, where countries are trying to be the first one to introduce the vaccine. And in that process, we also see that some of the scientific elements of research, and particularly, say, clinical trial, are being neglected. On one hand, we see an excellent display of scientific advancement. On the other hand, we see that there is some way of undermining the scientific evidence in trying to propagate or in rushing towards something which is politically very important to do. So I think as a research community and scientific community, as academicians, we have a very critical role to play, and which is to be able to stand independent and raise the right questions. These questions are being already raised about how when there is, even under the expedited process of clinical trials, how the other vaccine that the country is trying to introduce, which has not gone through third phase of clinical trial, is being procured. So I think one of the lessons that we learn from this entire experience of vaccine is, on one hand, the collectiveness of scientific community in an unprecedented manner. At the other end, the need for independent research in shaping policies, in informing policies, and often that means standing against the political trend and being able to show the merit of independent research. It reminds me of one of the very fascinating examples of how independent research can shape public policy in the country. We can go back a decade And there was a lot of debate about whether the economic reforms have been able to provide adequate gains to the millions of people. And there were the large section of academia and policy makers were boosting about the economic reform has led to enormous benefits for the people. And then there are some independent researchers, academicians who came out and said that the rural India is facing enormous distress. Millions of people being pushed to poverty, and we need to address that concern. And their independent research, which were not even getting published in the mainstream media at that point of time and vehemently rejected by the dominant political force at that time, actually stood the time. And when we saw political change, we saw that one of the most important policy in independent history coming into being. I'm referring to the Employment Guarantee Act. So there are, I think these are inspiring examples. Sometimes when as independent researchers, we might have to go against the current political wisdom or the policy environment, and to be able to speak the truth to the power, about the power, and irrespective of whether power knows about truth or not. It is our responsibility. And I think someday or the other, that the value of independent research always shows up in making concrete changes to human life. I'll stop here. It was a fascinating
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Indranil. That was excellent. I don't know if we can get some questions. We have some time for that. It's been such
we certainly can, sir.
No, but you know, Rohan, Samir, and Gursharan have been, you know, on the ball from morning. So I'm concerned about, you know, the kind of energy levels that you have. I envy you. So if you've got some questions, we can raise them. Gurshan, can you help me with that?
I actually have a question. If I
Oh,
may
you
be
do?
allowed to
Oh,
ask
very
a
good.
question,
Let's go on.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I was listening with rapt attention to everything that the distinguished panelists said. I particularly enjoyed your comment about your master who said, what I don't know isn't knowledge. And I would also like to congratulate Dr. Arushi Jain on what I believe is a fantastic project on data that you're doing for journalists, madam. I think it's the need of the hour. My best wishes to you on this program. Professor Pelissari, you mentioned that you're trying to you've created an institution and a program which prepares students to be able to live in India for 1 month. And that's a value and principle that we at SKOCH hold very dear to our hearts. In fact, everyone at SKOCH is mandated to spend a particular amount of time every year at the grassroots on field visits, studying what's happening on the ground. I have a question in general to the panel. Since Dr. Saifuddin also mentioned that, well, you know, academics are not PR experts, and often, like Dr. Arushi Jain quoting Shapiro et al. Said, research is lost in translation or perhaps before translation. What is the importance of pertinent, timely, and effective issue framing in driving agenda setting for public policy discourse today in a world where debates are being extremely polarized? For instance, the farm law debates have been reduced to an argument between a singer and an actress on Twitter. Right? How does research institutions, how does academia, how do universities, you know, effectively issue frame in advance for positive agenda setting for public policy discourse?
Well, who'll take this? The question is open.
I can start with a very general answer, but very quickly, because I'd rather open it up to my Indian colleagues than to give a generalist approach answer. But I feel like we're in a world where binary terms are very important. So you're a capitalist or you're a communist or it's globalization. And if you tear these words apart, these terms apart, then they're meaningless because they have too many meanings. Globalization isn't anything because it's everything. Communism and capitalism aren't anything because they're so diverse in terms of what components make up those things that they're not anything. And we live in a society where we want quick, fast, hard news, and we want to say, here's your allies, here's your enemies, go at them. And part of that is that we create these binary worlds where something is good and something is bad, and you need to pick your team and then move on with that. That it seems to be that that's what we want as a society. What the masses desire is to have a team and an enemy. But I don't know. So to answer your question, I think I'll turn it over to the colleagues. But I think that we need to move away from these big catch-all terms that have absolutely no meaning when you break them down scientifically.
Right. Each of you, I mean, Arushi, you want to have a comment on that question that Rohan
Sure.
raised?
Yeah. So Rohan, who drives that entire thing, I would like to suggest here, driving is a different issue, but I think what should be done is something that we need to deliberate going ahead and moving not just towards the controversy, but in general. One suggestion that I have is to equip, the bottom of the pyramid in this entire research framework. What I'm referring to here is, there is abundance of students, researchers, PhD scholars who are working in the field right now. They are moving in the rural areas, collecting primary data, and are somewhere, at link with the grassroots. So what needs to be done here is to have a standardized methodological approach, or else, organizing some kind of programs or a set of framework that can be given to them so that they are at the grassroots and they can help and see the entire policy from a monitoring evaluation lens. And if the bottom of the pyramid is strong, it's going to actually strengthen the entire ecosystem as such. So that is something I feel can be done moving ahead.
Right. Tony, you got a comment on that quickly?
Yes, quickly. I think for us, we have been a country of these kind of polarized debate. If we go back to our foundational experience of being an independent state, it is Gandhi's vision of to be one day village-based, and Nehru coming and saying, no, we want a industrial-based, Ambedkar saying, no, the village is a den of ignorance. So we have been a country of these kind of polarized debates. But what do public policy education, public policy emergence do to this kind of a scenario? And I think there is a role. The role is to create informed debate. Of course, in 1950s, what happened was we did not want an informed debate. That's why we wanted to solve it very technocratically. For example, Planning Commission was a very clear technocratic institution which will take the politics out of such debates and solve it technically. And yes, that is one solution. Do we want to do it? Or do we want to bring centrality of the politics and say that, no, we will debate it. We will have an informed debate. So can public policy schools create avenues for such informed debate, not ideological debates? And then we will have a meaningful exchange and the earlier idea what we talked, that is creation of the common knowledge.
Yeah, thank you, Pusoni. I mean, what this emphasizes is that in public policy, the process of formulating the policy is absolutely critical. The more consultations there are, the more people generally understand why a policy is formulated. So let's grant that the three farmers' laws will do a lot of good for our farmers. Let's concede that. But if you rush it through Parliament, you don't send it to a standing committee for discussion, you don't invite opinions from the farmers themselves because the policy is meant to benefit them, then you run into the kind of impasse that we are currently facing. So one of the major lessons of public policy is it's not so important what the policy eventually is, but you reach to that policy outcome after consultations and debate and listening to different kinds of viewpoints. I mean, that's basically the core of any liberal democracy, that you value people's opinions, that you find avenues for that opinion to be expressed, and then you make a decision. So even if people are unhappy with the decision, they will be glad that they were involved and consulted and participated in the decision-making process, even if the outcome is not palatable to them. So this habit of, consultation, listening to people, creating avenues, fora for discussion, which, you referred to, what Weber referred to, which is, your view should be always contestable. Allow for that contestation. And so I think that's very important lesson. And so we need to teach and inculcate this. But I want Indranil to also have a quick word on this question.
So I think one of the tasks that we have as academicians or as teachers is to be able to at least put it into perspective that there are many views. Whether a policy is beneficial or not is it depends on where do you stand, and that's where probably as the political economy of policies become very, very crucial, and it is our task as academicians, as independent researchers, or as teachers to be able to expose students to the realities of the world and to help them understand the world better, and also put that up front. I think that's it. I'll close here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll now turn to any other view of questions. Samir, Gursharan.
No, in fact, when we talk in terms of public policy, the biggest practitioner of public policy having the farthest reaching impact anywhere, the only one name that I can think of was Mahatma Gandhi. The reason was very simple, that he accumulated the knowledge and spent years and years together trying to understand the pain what people suffer with, which was the outcome orientation. So felt needs into policy. Of course, he accumulated knowledge first, then it became the applied knowledge. The simple reason for that was that the length and the breadth, communities after communities, whether tribals or non-tribals or Hindus or the Sikhs or Muslims or whatever it is, cross country, and the international exposure and experience that was brought to bear. So that's exactly where lies the answer as to, in case we have to be the good practitioners of public policy, meaning to say, you have to have your linkage with the grassroots. And that is about the only thing that you can do the service to the nation in a manner which is desirable.
Right. Gushan, I once heard Ashish Nandi tell me that Gandhi touched the hearts of people and swayed them, whereas Nehru, educated at Harrow and Cambridge, although he said the right things, simply didn't have quite that kind of, emotional connect. So you see, emotions are also very important in formulation of public policy. So I think, we need to get our students to understand a little bit of psychology and how emotions play a part, behavioral economics, nudge, all that sort of thing. So it's, and here we have in our country this example of someone, who Gandhiji would just touch the hearts and minds of so many people. And even though Prime Minister Nehru said many things that are absolutely correct and, quite didn't have that emotional contact. And I think that's a big difference. And so what you're emphasizing is really that there should be a certain element of passion in communication that kind of, seeks out, so that you're not making public policy only from the head, but there's the heart that's brought into this, and that's a big challenge. But I think we need to address that because, we are all our public policy schools are very new, and we are, building the ship as we are sailing it. And this kind of a forum, advice from, people like Mike and others is immensely valuable. So I just want to say I'm very, very grateful to the SKOCH Foundation, to Samir, to you, Gursharan, Rohan, for enabling us to have this conversation and to bring this wonderful public policy forum to a conclusion. So I just have to record my gratitude in those words.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Sudarshan. It was wonderful, wonderful, wonderful listening to all your academics. I never had the privilege of higher education. I had to start working straight away after school, and I did my graduation by correspondence. So I think I missed out something in life. One anecdote that I like to say is that, like you said, heart is required. What we call heart is actually felt needs. And that is where I think perhaps Scotch is the only organization in India who's been trying to bridge that gap for 20 years, where, we evaluate so much, we talk to people so much, we travel so much, and we try to bring the sense of the people, like a sense of the house, to the policymakers, saying that this is what is going on. I also believe that, this engagement that we have with policy schools should not be episodal, it should be ongoing. We get so much of data, we get so much of information, we get so many nominations of real projects that are happening. Why can't students work on sorting those out, reading them, asking us what questions to ask, doing some secondary research? Now, this is live project, and it goes straight into policy, and you see it goes to the topmost echelons of policy. And I'm sure that between Rohan and Gursharan, they would be happy to engage with you and do that. And we could also get them to do some actual policy research on some burning issues that we're already dealing with. And, we're doing, because we are into public policy advocacy. We don't do anything sponsored. There's no industry, there's no big bag money behind us. We do everything on our time and effort basis. So then why not come and partner with us, because we need as many hands and brains as we can get. The joke I was wanting to share with you was that about our approach was that, we do this grassroots research, and our approach is very Gandhian. So we go to a village, we'll talk to the Pradhan, or we'll sit under a tree, get a focus group going of 10, 15 people and ask them, what's going on. There is no methodology really. So one very, very senior economist, who is currently a very senior economist in the government, at those days he wasn't, he told us that, since you're doing the effort, why don't you make a questionnaire? And I said, ठीक है boss, हमको क्या है, हम कैसे बनाते हैं questionnaire? So we made a questionnaire. So we were going to do an evaluation of Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. And we asked, we did this village group thing, and we went to a village which has been connected with a Pradhan Mantri road, another one which was not connected with it, and we did our survey. So, and we came back and we presenting the findings. So this economist asked me, so how many people think that the road is useful? I said, all of them, including the people whose land has been taken over to build the damn road. He says, how many people disagree with it? I said, none. He says, then your survey is not statistically valid, because someone has to disagree with it. And I said, sorry, I know, thank God, our villagers are neither statisticians nor stupid. So they know a good thing and appreciate it when they get it. So I think this is where the policy making lacks.
Right.
So with that, on that note, thank you very much. We look forward to engaging with you. Hopefully, Mike, maybe UCL can be an academic partner next time on.
Yes, we have to get Mike out to India.
I would be honored. I've actually worked with several provincial governments for the IMF in India, and I've been extremely surprised by the friendliness and professionalism of Indian authorities, which you usually get one or the other, but in India you get both friendly and professional. I didn't know about the India
work. I've read your Bangladesh work. Yeah.
Yes, I've also engaged with the government of Bangladesh. I was in Chennai and Bangalore 2 years ago working with the state governments there, but exceptional talent in government in India.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arushi Jain, Dr. Indraneel, Professor Soni. We also have, by the way, national discourse on national health coming up. So
right. No, yes, that's right. So we're keen on it. Yeah.
All right.
Thank
so
you.
With that, we close this session. The only thing I want to point out is that we started at 8 a.m. in the morning, and we've consistently had 800 people. Now it's 12 and a half hours. We still have 97 delegates in the room. So
that's fantastic. Yes, amazing.
Hats off. Let's be kind to them.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the live audience that is with us at 8:30 p.m. on a Saturday evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Sir.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah. Thank you, Indranil. Thank you, Sony. Thank you, Arushi. And thank you, Mike.